This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because of course this has enormous implications.
What just happened? Adam here. So this has just happened. The Supreme Court didn't just rule against Trump's tariff policy, it detonated it. The financial consequence alone could reach $200 billion in refund liability because the court ruled those tariffs were collected illegally. This wasn't a routine check on executive power. It was the judicial branch lowering the boom on the centerpiece economic policy of this presidency.
A federal judge ruled that companies that paid tariffs put in place by President Trump but later struck down by the Supreme Court are now entitled to refunds. This ruling offers some clarity about the tariff refund process, which the Supreme Court did not mention in its February decision. The judge said that he alone will hear cases pertaining to the refund of tariffs Trump imposed under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Costco is among the companies planning legal action to get a refund. The federal government collected more than $130 billion through December in these now defunct tariffs.
Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the mainstream coverage gave you the headline but completely failed to explain why this ruling is genuinely catastrophic for Trump's second term. The case centered on Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs. These were sweeping global tariffs that covered virtually all imports from virtually all countries simultaneously.
President Trump declaring today, April 2nd, as Liberation Day. The president talked all about those new reciprocal tariffs to punish countries that tax U.S.-made goods. But some economists are warning that it's us, the American shoppers, who will pay the price, at least to start. Eric Brown takes us to the Rose Garden.
President Trump says America's trade deficit is a threat to national security, and he has declared a national emergency in order to create sweeping new tariffs.
Tariffs give our country protection against those that would do us economic harm.
Trump is placing a baseline 10% tariff on all countries that exports goods to the U.S. Dozens of countries will also face reciprocal tariffs on top of that. Those reciprocal tariffs will start at half of what each country is taxing the U.S.
If you want your tariff rate to be zero, then you build your product right here in America.
The Trump administration claimed authority for this massive economic intervention under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law passed back in 1977 that was designed for genuine national emergencies, targeted sanctions against specific countries, not for peacetime global trade wars. The Supreme Court looked at this claim and rejected it, 6-3, and here is the detail that should stop you cold. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion himself. Two of Trump's own appointees joined that majority. The president's hand-picked justices turned against his signature economic policy. Roberts used a phrase that is going to echo through the rest of American history. He wrote that the statutory language of IEPA cannot bear such weight. That is the court's way of saying the Trump administration asked a law to do something it was never designed to do, something so far beyond its intended scope that the law simply collapsed under the pressure. This is not just a ruling about tariffs. This is a permanent constitutional constraint on every future president who might try to use broad statutory language as a blank check for sweeping economic action. The Major Questions Doctrine, which requires clear and specific congressional authorization for any executive claim of vast economic and political significance, has now been extended from administrative agencies directly to the president himself. That changes everything. That is a legacy-defining limitation that will constrain Republican and Democratic presidents alike for decades. But the constitutional dimension, as massive as it is only the beginning of the story. The financial dimension is where this ruling becomes genuinely devastating. When the Supreme Court ruled that the tariffs were illegally imposed, it was not just making a forward-looking statement about what the president can do going forward. It was making a backward-looking determination about every dollar collected under that illegal authority from the day the tariffs went into effect to the day the ruling halted collection. Every importer who paid those tariffs paid them under a legal authority that the Supreme Court has now definitively said did not exist. That means every dollar collected was collected without legal right, and the legal system provides a remedy for exactly that situation. Importers can file refund claims in the Court of International Trade based on the Supreme Court's illegal collection determination. The estimated total of those claims? $175 billion. Let that sink in. $175 billion that the government collected and now may have to give back. That is not a rounding error. That is not a manageable setback. That is a fiscal earthquake that destroys the entire budget architecture of Trump's second term. Remember the one big, beautiful bill that the administration was pushing through Congress. That legislation was built around the assumption that tariff revenue would continue flowing. That assumption is now dead. The revenue stream is terminated. The refund liability is active. And every fiscal projection, every legislative deal, every political promise that depended on that money has just been blown to pieces. Trump's reaction to the ruling told you everything you need to know about how seriously the administration assessed the damage. He called the justices who ruled against him, including his own appointees, a disgrace to the nation. You do not say that about your own Supreme Court picks unless the ruling has hit something so fundamental that you cannot spin it, cannot work around it, cannot simply brush it aside. Then Trump vowed to immediately impose a new 10% global tariff under a different trade law. He insisted he still had very powerful alternatives. But legal experts immediately warned that any alternative approach would face the same constitutional obstacle. The major questions doctrine does not care which statute the administration tries to use. If the statutory language is broad and general rather than clear and specific, the same cannot bear such weight analysis applies. The alternative pathway is not a clean escape. It is a legal minefield that the administration is walking into with its eyes wide open. Let me break down exactly why this ruling is so permanently consequential across three specific dimensions. First, the constitutional mechanics. Second, the financial destruction. Third, the political fallout that is already reshaping the midterm landscape. On the constitutional side, the major questions doctrine has been a cornerstone of conservative administrative law for years. It says that when an agency claims authority over something of vast economic and political significance, the statutory authorization for that authority must be clear and specific, not broad and general. What Roberts did in this ruling was extend that same doctrine to direct presidential power claims. That extension is permanent. It is a 6-3 ruling with a cross-ideological majority. It applies to every future president. And it means that any future attempt to use broad statutory language as the basis for sweeping economic action will face exactly the same constitutional hurdle that defeated the Liberation Day tariffs. The IEEPA historical context makes this crystal clear. That law was passed in 1977 specifically to address emergency economic powers that had previously been available under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. It was designed for genuine crisis situations, specific countries, specific threats, specific targeted responses. For decades, that is exactly how it was used. Sanctions against Iran, sanctions against North Korea, targeted actions in response to specific national security threats. What the Trump administration asked IEEPA to do was something else entirely. Sweeping peacetime global tariffs covering virtually all imports from virtually all countries simultaneously. That is not what the law was designed for. That is not what any reasonable reading of the law authorizes. And Roberts's phrase, "cannot bear such weight," is the most precise possible description of the mismatch between what the statute can legitimately do and what the administration was asking it to do. Now let me take you through the financial destruction in more detail because the $175 billion figure deserves careful explanation. When the Supreme Court rules that a tax or tariff was illegally imposed, that determination has retroactive effect. Every payment made under the illegal authority was, legally speaking, a payment made without authorization. The government took money it had no right to take, and when the government takes money without legal right, the people who paid that money have a legally enforceable claim to get it back. The Court of International Trade is the specific forum where these claims will be filed. Importers from every sector of the economy, from every country affected by the tariffs, will be lining up to file refund claims. The combination of hundreds of thousands of importers, years of tariff payments, and a definitive Supreme Court ruling that the collection was illegal creates the most legally compelling foundation for a refund litigation wave in American trade history. And the $175 billion estimate? That comes from analysts who have calculated the total tariffs collected under the invalidated authority. That is the exposure. That is what the government may have to pay back. But here is where the compounding effect becomes truly devastating. The forward-looking revenue stream is also gone. The Liberation Day tariffs were generating substantial ongoing revenue while they were in effect. That revenue is now terminated by the ruling, so the government loses future revenue at the same time it faces massive refund liability on past collections. The combination is a fiscal double whammy. The budget architecture that assumed tariff revenue would continue needs to be rebuilt from scratch. The legislative deals structured around specific fiscal numbers need to be renegotiated. And the political story of a fiscally responsible second-term agenda built on tariff revenue gets replaced by the political story of an agenda built on revenue the Supreme Court said was never legally the government's to take. That last point brings me to the political dimension, because this is where the ruling hits the midterm campaign trail with the most force. The Reuters and other major outlet characterizations of this ruling as reducing Trump's influence heading into the midterms are accurate, but they do not go far enough. This is not just a reduction in influence. This is a fundamental blow to the administration's economic credibility at exactly the moment when economic credibility is the most central political asset in competitive districts. Voters in swing districts care about the economy. They care about who can be trusted to govern responsibly. And when the president's signature economic policy has been struck down by his own Supreme Court appointees, when his government faces a $175 billion refund liability, when his alternative pathways face immediate legal challenges under the same constitutional framework that defeated the original approach, the message to those voters is clear. This administration does not have a stable economic strategy. This administration cannot be trusted to follow the law. This administration's fiscal promises are built on sand. Markets and lenders and foreign governments are watching too. They understand exactly what this ruling means for the reliability and durability of Trump's economic commitments. International trade partners who were negotiating under the assumption that the tariffs were here to stay now know that the legal foundation for those tariffs has been demolished. Creditors who were lending based on projected tariff revenue now know that revenue is gone. Businesses that made investment decisions based on the tariff landscape now need to rethink everything. The compounding effect across all three dimensions, constitutional, financial, and political, is what makes the extreme sanctions characterization so precisely accurate. This ruling does not just say Trump was wrong on this specific tariff claim. It does not just invalidate the specific tariff scheme. It exposes the government to historic refund liability. It permanently constrains every future president from making similar claims. It destroys the fiscal architecture of the administration's legislative agenda. It reduces market and institutional confidence in the administration's economic commitments. And it hands Democrats a devastating narrative for the midterms. Let me give you 4 specific things to watch as the downstream consequences of this ruling continue to unfold. First, watch the Court of International Trade docket. The pace and scale at which importer refund claims are filed will tell you how quickly the financial consequences materialize. Watch also how the government responds to those claims. Every defense the administration mounts will signal its assessment of the total refund liability and its willingness to fight rather than settle. Second, watch the One Big Beautiful Bill legislative process. The fiscal architecture of that bill was built around tariff revenue assumptions that are now dead. How the administration and congressional Republicans rebuild that architecture, what alternative funding sources they find, and whether the political deals that were structured around the original numbers can survive the restructuring will tell you how completely the ruling has disrupted the legislative agenda. Third, watch the legal challenges to any alternative tariff authority Trump tries to impose. If the administration follows through on its vow to impose a new 10% global tariff under a different trade law, that new tariff will be challenged immediately. How quickly courts apply the major questions doctrine to that new authority, and whether the cannot bear such weight analysis applies with equal force, will tell you whether the constitutional obstacle is as comprehensive as legal experts predict. Fourth, watch the midterm political landscape. Look for signals that the ruling is affecting economic credibility arguments in competitive districts. Look for Democratic candidates hammering the $175 billion refund liability. Look for Republican candidates trying to distance themselves from the tariff policy that just blew up in their faces. Look for independent voters expressing doubts about which party can be trusted to govern the economy responsibly. The bottom line is this. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that IEEPA cannot bear the weight of Trump's sweeping tariff claims. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. 2 Trump appointees joined the majority. The major questions doctrine was extended to direct presidential power claims in ways that permanently constrain the entire theory of executive economic authority through broad statutory interpretation. Up to $175 billion in illegally collected tariff revenue creates a historic refund liability. The combination of lost ongoing revenue, active refund liability, constrained alternative pathways, and reduced market credibility compounds into the most damaging possible outcome for the administration's economic governance strategy. Trump called his own appointees a disgrace to the nation. That is the specific signal of how seriously the ruling was internally assessed. You do not say that about justices you put on the court unless you know the damage is catastrophic and permanent. The extreme sanctions characterization is not hyperbole. It is the most precisely accurate description available of a ruling whose financial, constitutional, and political consequences most specifically justify the most dramatic available characterization of what the Supreme Court delivered to the Trump administration. The court he stacked imposed the most extreme available sanctions on the most central available economic policy of his second term. The precedent is permanent, the refund liability is real, and the political consequences are the most immediately available expression of what happens when the highest court in the country says you went too far. Here is exactly what that costs you. Your signature policy is gone, your budget is shattered, your credibility is damaged, your opponents have a new weapon, and your own appointees just told the world that your legal theory could not bear the weight of your ambition. We are going to be right here watching every single development as the downstream consequences continue to unfold. The Court of International Trade docket, the legislative negotiations, the alternative tariff challenges, the midterm campaigns, all of it, because this ruling is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in which the full cost of overreach comes due. And that cost, measured in dollars, in constitutional constraints, and in political damage, is higher than almost anyone predicted before the court handed down its decision.